this podcast, you'll find interviews with high-performing, successful individuals in life sciences. On a weekly basis, we cover their proven methods, principles, strategies, and mindsets to implement new technologies that scale to meet the needs of people in our world.
Welcome to this episode of Life Science Success. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Don, and I'm a digital marketer in life sciences. And so in this episode of Life Science Success, I wanted to welcome Megha Sinha. She's the founder and CEO of Kamet Consulting Group. She brings 17 years of experience in the pharma and life sciences and regulatory operations, quality, and large-scale transformation, including senior leadership at PwC, solving complex regulatory, supply chain, and lifecycle management challenges. So with that, welcome. It's great to have you on.
Thank you, Don. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. So would you mind just taking a moment and just telling the listeners just a little bit about yourself? And what was it that brought you to life sciences?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm a chemical and biomedical engineer by training. When I was in college, my senior project really was extraction of reserpine, which is the active ingredient in antihypertensive drugs. And that was really the formation for me into getting into, healthcare and life sciences. I wanted to make sure that, I understand how the products go from clinical to, R&D through commercial and regulatory. And that's really what drew me in. I started actually at a small medical device company where I grew into a role where I was managing, R&D, regulatory quality, and manufacturing quality, which essentially, gave me a full broad view into functions or, really value streams that touches the product life cycle. Also I remember leading my 2-week FDA on-site audit, first job out of the college, which was really fun for me. And, that gave me the breadth of experience. After that, I went into Stryker. So really, learning what I learned and applying that at scale. But the chemical engineering foundation, I always had the itch that I wanted to do work in pharma and biotech also. And that's what led me to PwC. And honestly, that engineering training never really left me. So when I read a regulation today, I'm looking at it as an engineering problem. I'm looking at those regulations as, what are the constraints that need to be solved for? What's the critical path? What's the dependency? And really, that's the instinct, that has stayed with me. And I always wanted to be in a environment where I'm making a little bit of difference in, people's life. And so, I've always really wanted to be in healthcare and life sciences.
I find it interesting that you say that your first FDA audit was exciting and interesting because I don't think I would characterize it that way. I remember the first time I was in the back room of an FDA audit. I mean, one of the more anxious times in my career, I think. So.
I know, but, when you are a 25-year-old new grad, sitting in the front, not in the back room or the war room, but in the front as the management rep, you just, have to swim or sink, right? And I think, that's what was fun. I did not understand probably at the time the responsibility that I had for the company, but it was exciting because I learned so much. I learned to negotiate. I learned to really deal with regulators very early on in my career, which I feel like a lot of people, don't really get so early on. So that's why I call it exciting and fun.
And you just mentioned your PwC experience a little bit ago. How has your PwC experience influenced your approach to your consulting business today?
Yeah, by the time I got to PwC, as I mentioned, I had already, built and led functions that most consultants only advise on, from their experience doing projects. So, when I did this at the small medical device company and then at Stryker, I really was coming in, at a different level than a typical consultant. I really came in, as I said, because I wanted to expand into, the pharma and biotech sector and not just stay in medical device. And what PwC gave me was access to transactions that most people never see, which is $25 billion acquisitions, $63 billion merger, then, multi-billion dollar divestitures. And when you are inside these programs, you learn very quickly that, strategy without execution is just a slide deck, right? But execution in this space also meant, hands-on keyboard work, right? It means really sitting in your client's regulatory operations or labeling or quality functions, really understanding how health authorities, react to certain things, knowing that, in some countries, if your GMP certificate is, expiring in 6 months, they will not accept it. And that level of operational depth, you can't really learn if you haven't done that, and I felt like that was the edge, that I had. But, on the other side, you do have firms that do the hands-on keyboard, work. They know all of the regulatory complexities. They have done submissions, but then they haven't done, strategic programs, right? So I think that's what shaped Kamet for me. I really saw a gap where, there weren't firms that were deep in both. And because I had, uh, led strategies at that deal scale, and I have done hands-on keyboard work, that combination is what, Kamet kind of brings to every engagement. I don't think that is a perspective that a lot of firms have, and I think that is our differentiator.
Yeah, for sure. That depth and breadth is important, and having, I mean, I kind of look at it as I hear your description, right? Having an incubator where you can kind of come in and out of different organizations and gain all of that experience and kind of move on is very, critically important. So let's talk a little bit about your experience and how it's sort of, shaped you. With more than 17 years in working across regulatory operations, quality, and supply chain, what are some of the largest pharma, organizations that you've been, maybe had the opportunity to interact with, but also like, what were some of those most pivotal moments?
Yeah, I wouldn't be able to name names, right? We are all bound by confidentiality, but really there are a few pivotal moments that stand out in my career, and I'll probably boil it down to three. The first really was my first job, right? As I said, I grew, I started out in kind of doing R&D regulatory, and then moving into this role where I was, doing R&D, I was doing regulatory, I was doing quality and manufacturing quality. I remember even, gowning up and going into a clean room and, my line worker showing me how to build a product. I think that experience, a lot of people don't get so early on in your career. When you're at a small company, you wear many hats. And so you learn a lot of things. And I think that shaped how I thought about consulting, or how I really thought about dealing with problems as I moved on, so that I think early experience was really interesting in how it shaped my perspective to come. And, the second one I would say, which I always remember, is what made me think about, consulting completely differently. I was leading, this was probably about 5 years into, my career. I was leading one of my first big spin-offs, of a company where the standard playbook that most consulting firms will run is, and this is true till date, and this is what we're trying to, make sure we can disrupt, is they'll create 100-column, survey, which then gets sent out to the local affiliates, that is asking a bunch of questions to ensure that, they can plan the strategy and the, kind of operational work behind it. But what was interesting about this deal was that the company was being acquired by an industrial conglomerate. So this was their first life sciences company. There was no international regulatory infrastructure. There was no affiliates, to send this survey out to. So we were the affiliates. So the standard playbook that we had ran till then kind of went out the window, and I had to build an entirely new approach from scratch. So what we did is we sat down, we actually read regulations country by country. We sent out regulations for translation to really understand, what needs to happen. When you set up legal entities, you can't just operationalize those legal entities. You have to actually get establishment licenses and operating permits to let those legal entities be a medical device company or be a pharma company, right? So the level of depth that we got, really through that program was immense. And I think that gained us a lot of credibility, not only with our own clients, but with the parent company, because we were able to interact with their regulatory teams and with their supply chain teams with confidence that a survey summary will not give you, right? Because it really is answered in a way that people understand the question. So I think that was really also a pivotal point for me, because it changed how I now approach those projects, or projects that have similar complexity. And the third one, very quickly, was the large, $63 billion pharma merger that I did. The same complexity at that scale with very complex, portfolio. And that we applied. And I think because we knew how to go deep, we were able to still coordinate, even though back then we were still doing all of this, in spreadsheet. And I think, even today, the typical consulting playbook is to facilitate and not to know. Companies hire us to be expert and to work with their expert. We can't just be generalists and just be facilitator and just be the people who take other people's work. And so I think, all of these experience have really planted the seed for everything I've built since then.
And then what was it that inspired you to found Kamet?
Yeah, I think a lot of what I've already said, but, really the gap was in that, the companies that are out there don't have talented, regulatory operations or supply chain teams, right? All of our clients do. They're very smart people. But the gap happens when those teams, are hit with a major company lifetime event while doing all of their business as usual work, right? So when an acquisition closes or divestiture happens, or they're doing launch planning while still competing with all of the changes that are happening to their marketed product, they are, suddenly that same team is now stretched very thin. Typically what happens is that when they go and look for help, they find two types of firms. They find the large consulting firm that can really build a program and a governance framework. But again, when it comes to execution, they haven't done that hands-on keyboard work. So they can't really, give you a strategy that is operationally sound. And then, on the other side, as I said, there are firms that have done the operational work, but they haven't done the strategy, and they haven't, run 6 functional work stream, in parallel. And what I saw is that, clients needed both. They deserve both from the same team. They needed the strategic perspective and the operational depth, not one or the other. And, because we have done this at deal scale, that's what Kamet was built for. That this combination is really what allows us to sit with our reg ops, partner and supply chain team as a real extension of them, not as strategists, who can't execute, or operational teams that can't strategize, because we do see that full picture.
Yeah, I don't know if this applies in this space or not, but I wanted to sort of tease out a little bit more detail with regards to
Yeah.
this as well. So as I think about the bigger firms, right? In my large corporate experience, the main thing I ran into was they walk in with their, call it a program, like whatever their normal menu is.
Framework.
Like
Yeah. Yeah.
here's our slideshow, and here's what we do. We go from here to here, and aren't we great because we've done this across lots of different, let's say, bigger organizations. Now all of a sudden, if I'm a smaller organization, I've got a lot of things that are variables in my space, and I've got a lot of things that I'm going to need help with, and probably need help in educating people on my team, but also
Yeah.
like educating, some of the regulators as well, possibly, especially in today's
Yeah.
world of AI and everything else that's coming at us. Um, I'm envisioning a firm like Kamet, being able to help with those sort of, hey, I've got a dynamic situation. I don't need your standard program. I need you to come in and help with this. And that's probably a better fit, unless I am not reading the space right. So
No, absolutely. That's exactly what it is. And, you will be surprised as how even the bigger companies now, need that dynamic framework, right? Because everyone is trying to enable technology within their organization. And if you just come with a standard playbook, that is typically not going to work anymore, right? So it's also about how can we be cost effective and efficient for our own clients, and we work with startups, right? We work with a lot of student-led startups, founder-led startups, all the way through to the largest, pharma, biotech, medical device companies. And I think that should tell you that the need is universal. We have displaced some of the bigger firms and some of the deal work that we have done in the last couple of years. And I think that is because we are bringing the depth that a lot of these firms don't, bring. They're very smart people. They just never had the chance to go as deep as, our practitioners have. And I think that's where we are really differentiated. And I'm excited to continue to, be at the frontier of that, right? Because, I kind of want to put this tidbit. A lot of people ask me why the name Kamet, and Kamet actually was the first summit that was climbed on the Himalayas. It wasn't the highest, it's not the highest, but it was the first. And that's what I want to be. I want to be first in how we innovate for our industry.
it's very important. But this leads me naturally to my next question as well, which is, what is the mission for Kamet? And then
Yeah.
what types of problems do you really solve? I mean, I feel like we've kind of touched on a few of them, but also, like, are there
Yeah.
more specifics?
Yeah, so the core mission is really when, we want to be partner to the life sciences ecosystem. So, your pharmaceutical, biotech, med device, as well as consumer health companies. When a program is complex, it's multi-market, global in nature, or cross-functional enough that, a single team cannot really manage on top of their day job, right? So that can be a deal situation that I've already described. It can be that you're doing launch planning while you're adding new countries, right? So you're doing a global expansion and you're doing launch planning in already existing markets. You're doing a cross-functional process transformation where you need to again understand those functional depths that need to come in, right? So those are the types of programs that we really excel in, where we have to really know the functions, we have to really know the requirements, we have to really know how the workflow, the value stream, flows. And as I said, what we do is we really want to work together, and together to me is the most critical word, because nothing gets accomplished if you're coming in just as advisor, really handing in deliverables. So we embed ourselves, in clients' regulatory operations or supply chain or quality or PMO teams, where we can truly work together with them. Because sometimes, we will get the program started, we'll get it operational, and then we leave, right? So we need to make sure that the clients' teams are coming along with us so that the program is successful in the end.
Let's talk a little bit about the global nature of some of the work that you do as well. So in terms of the regulators that you work with, or programs that you've worked on, I would imagine that you have to deal with lots of different regulatory agencies around the world.
Yeah.
Just really curious, here to kind of, provide some, again, some some level of clarity for anybody that might be listening to this later.
Yeah, so we have really worked, as I said, for with over 80 plus countries at this point. We're not going to do, because a lot of countries require local language submission. Like we're not going to write submissions, in every language, but we can create kind of core dossier for you. I know there's a lot of specialized firms that do that, right? But things that really make us different, from a programmatic standpoint is, first of all, we don't really separate strategy from execution, right? So you have to make sure your strategic plan is execution ready, right? Whatever sector, or whatever part of the, function whatever part of the program it is in, right? Whether you're doing large scale, process transformation, or you're doing a merger and acquisition, or you're doing, lifecycle change management, you have to make sure the strategy that you set can actually be executed. And I think that's where we're different because, again, when we do these, life cycle change management programs or M&A programs, we don't leave at, hey, you need to go and file variations in these, 10 markets. We actually sit down with our clients and we say, what type of variation, in EU, is it a type 1A or type 2? Because that distinction really matters. Or do you also have, other changes that are ongoing where we can bundle those changes? Does these country actually allow you to bundle the changes or not? We also build kind of the submission sequencing, right, very deliberately, because as you probably know, and our listeners, that, in pharma as well as medical device, you have to have a major market, or what is called a reference market approval in order for you to then cascade that to, other countries. And if you don't really understand, the requirements of, hey, Brazil actually needs you to submit a CPP that is, legalized, which is going to take additional 90 days. Or I actually need this corporate document from, my legal team, and it's going to take me, 120 days to get that. Then if you create a plan, which is in absence of those dependencies and in absence of those constraints, those strategic programs are, not executable. And I think that's where we're different, where we are bringing that depth which is needed in strategy. I'll kind of give an anecdote. I was, at my previous firm, and one of the early career consultant came to me and said, I want to be a strategy consultant. And, I told him, how would you be a strategy consultant if you don't understand the operational aspects that CEOs and CFOs and, all of these senior leaders care about? And I think that's what I've learned in my career, is both sides are equally important and one doesn't exist, without the other.
I think it's a really critical point because there are a lot of, in my experience, again, with a lot of different consulting firms, or a lot of companies that will drop off like, hey, here's the perfectly shaped plan. And that's
Yep.
fine. But we all know whenever it comes down to execution, normally the path isn't a linear path. We're going to go through this sort of
Never. Yeah.
crooked line of getting to the end goal. And it's going to be it's going to be something that we have to figure out along the way. How do we appropriately not only navigate it, but how do we then navigate around the challenges we find too?
Yeah, you have to have a plan B and a plan C and a plan D, right? It will never work that your first plan is perfect. You obviously try to do it perfectly, right? But I think this is where what you want to achieve, what's the end outcome, is so critical. And, we're very transparent with our clients, saying, you probably won't be able to achieve everything. You probably won't be able to make a cultural shift in your organization at the same time you're doing this process transformation, at the same time rolling out a new, technology. You probably need to do that, in a stepwise fashion. We will try to do it, but I think, it's very difficult to be able to achieve. And so this is why, you need a plan B and a plan C and a plan D to achieve what is the actual final outcome you want, and then what are nice to haves, along the way, kind of cherry on top. So yeah, it's absolutely important to have those, in your back pocket.
Yeah, so you've mentioned large scale transformation a few different times, and I know that that can mean a few different things as well. Can you give us a sense of what that looks like in practice whenever you engage with a pharmaceutical company, and talk through the initial assessment through the execution?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give you a real example of, a client that we're working with currently. It's a $14 billion, global spinoff. It's a major company carving out kind of their entire, business into its own standalone, entity. And the programs like this are multi-year, right? They're not, you can't just get them done, right? So we typically kind of break them up into two phases, right? So phase one is take control, right? That's what I always tell my clients in these situations, especially spinoffs, is you have to set up, your legal entity structure, right? You have to make sure you can take control of all of the registrations, all of the logistics that exist, out there. So your distribution centers, your quality agreements, what does that mean? How are you going to set that up? As I said early on, what operating permits do you need to actually, get these legal entities operating as a pharma or med device company. And so, kind of set that up, take control, because, the first thing people want is brand change. People want to get their new brand out there. We're this, we're that. We want to get, our brand out there. And, that sometimes have to come later, because you have to first own, the products that you just divested, right? So that takes about, anywhere from 12 to 18 months to just complete that phase one, right? So that's, you do the assessment, and you do the plan, and then you execute, right? And then the next phase is really about everything else, right? So, okay, now I need to change the name of these entities, because, sometimes you have placeholder names. I now need to rebrand. I need to change, who my product owner is or legal manufacturer is on the medical device side, right? So that's another phase. And so if you think about just what I said, it's not, just, oh, you are one and done. You're just changing, legal entity, or you're just changing legal manufacturer. Typically, there are multitude of changes that are happening together, right? So you have to figure out the most efficient, plan and strategy. Can you bundle them? If you can't bundle them, what are you going to do? Do you submit a new new marketing application or new registration application? So we have to, the way, we start is we sit down with, the client's regulatory and supply chain and the PMO leadership to really map out the full impact together, not just what is needed. What are the changes? A lot of times, with this company, we got brought in a little bit later. Phase one was already underway, and they had identified some of the changes, and we said, no, you actually have more changes. And we showed them that they had actually missed 7 other changes that would have happened over the course of over the course of the deal life cycle. And, to me, it really is, like an orchestra, right? So you have to forward plan, and then you have to backward plan, and then you have to forward plan again till you get that perfect symphony. And, when I say large scale transformation, it doesn't just end there, right? It doesn't end, oh, now you have a plan. We will stay through, execution, making sure that, the plan gets updated on a regular basis, because regulations change. You may have planned to do submission at a point that, went in late or went in early, which then will cascade into other things. And, that's what, to me, and that takes about, 18 to 24 months, right? So that, to me, is what large scale transformation looks like, really getting into the depth of the planning and the strategy and the execution, and making sure that, the last product is moved into your normal logistics and supply chain process. And, this is just one example. Obviously, there are similar examples on the process transformation side or the organizational excellence side, where you need to understand, each element and each pillar keenly to really put that full puzzle together.
Yeah, just to recognize as well. So we have Daniel Lozano with us. He said he completely agrees with you. And pharma medical device transactions regulatory isn't a downstream work stream; it's a gathering function. So there's much more to his
Yeah.
comment that I'm sure you'll see on LinkedIn whenever you're there. But just wanted to just recognize Daniel.
That's
Thank you
great.
for leaving the comment. I appreciate that. So also in terms of your being a founder, right? So you're a founder, you've got this very specialized consulting firm as well. How is it that you think about building and scaling a team that can do all of this specialized work, in the world's largest pharma companies?
Yeah, I think the work that we do, as I said, is very complex, right? So it really starts with hiring the people who have actually done the work and not managed it from a distance, right? So really the talent pool for what we do is small. So, we really, I'm very deliberate about who we bring into the team. We have a mix of people who were industry, and we hired them, and then other big four firms that, wanted to really go deep in one sector, right? And so I think that's kind of what we're hiring. And then really people who have the ability to, as I said, read a technical guidance or a regulatory guidance and dissect it, to build a strategy, right? So I think that combination is rare. So, I think that's the piece. The second part of how we scale is technology. And I think, traditional consulting, uh, firms are not using it the way it really can be. And, they typically scale by adding headcount. And I know there is buzz in the industry about more and more firms using AI, but, it really is about how do you use AI, right? It's not just about using AI. And I think what I'm focused on is really using technology to encode, the experience that we have had over these years and the operational knowledge that lives in our practitioners, and consultants' head or in spreadsheets, so that a team of 5 can cover the ground that, a team of 15 used to, 3 years ago. And I think this doesn't just help us with scale, but it makes us more effective and efficient for our clients. And this is where we truly believe in delivering outcomes, and then focusing our teams on really tasks that actually require human expertise. So technology handles the knowledge and our people handle the decision. So I think that's kind of how I'm thinking about it.
I do think it's interesting, right? Because finding those people that can not only look at things tactically, right? Because in my view, oftentimes the regulations are just a very tactical sort of document. If you read it word for word, it tells you exactly what the regulators are looking for. It's not like there's some mystery
Yeah.
that's out there. That's not the
Yeah.
intent of the regulation. But then also, you have to have people that could say, okay, so that's what it said. Now this is how, not only how I apply it or how it impacts the larger organization or even the thing that I'm having to manage through. So I could see how you're, in reality, you're looking for a needle in the haystack, but also there are a fair amount of needles that are out there, I think, as well. So
Yeah, especially in our industry. I think I truly believe we have one of the smartest talent pool, in healthcare and life sciences. And I think it's really about giving those people the right opportunity to be able to solve bigger problems. I think that's what we strive to do for our, team. I'm sure if you talk to my team ever, they'll tell you, yes, she just throws us, into the deep end, and, they all swim. So, I'm hopefully doing a good job hiring the right people.
yeah. And then, you're mentioned on the technology side as well, right? I think there's no greater time than for anybody to use technology to try and and optimize not only your workforce, but also like the responses that people can give, and making sure that you're fed all the right information at the right time. And certainly with vector databases and AI and, all of the
Yeah.
technology that's out there, there's, a great wealth of capability that's there.
Absolutely. Completely agree. And I think especially with what technology is available to us today, all of the frontier AI models are really out there, and we can really take operational work from 0 to 100 in matter of, months, like solutions that would take us years to build, now are at our fingertips. And yeah, it's very exciting, what technology can really help us achieve today.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a few more questions about you before
Yeah.
we wrap up here. So the first one is, what's the greatest piece of leadership advice that you've ever received, and how has it influenced the way that you lead Kamet?
Yeah, someone told me very early on in my career is, don't confuse being busy with being effective. And, it sounds simple, but in consulting, especially, there is a constant, pressure to show activity and, more meetings and more, status report. But at Gamut, that's how we actually scope our engagements. We don't sell hours, we actually sell outcomes. And if we can solve a client's problem in half the time with better solutions and sharper focus, that is a win-win situation for both us and the clients. And, that's really shaped how I think about, how we scope the engagements here.
So important. What inspires you?
I think it's the complexity itself, honestly, and I think this comes from me being an engineer, and really the people managing it. I work with regulatory operational leaders who are tracking, 200 submissions across 30 countries, while onboarding a new site, with their marketing authorizations. I work with manufacturing operational leaders that are managing different flavors of the same product, that are shipping to different countries while implementing, multiple changes. That is highly complex operational work, to get the products to our patient. And they're doing it, with really basic tools or spreadsheets and institutional knowledge and human glue. And to me, that is resilience, and their resilience and their expertise is genuinely inspiring. And what really keeps me going is, when I work with these leaders where, we have solved a problem together, and that has, solved a market blackout, or, continued the supply to patient. And I think that is why this work is so critical. And, it really inspires me to keep going.
Absolutely. What concerns you?
I really think the growing gap between the pace of change and the tools that we have available today to manage it. Companies, I mean, I'm sure you're seeing in the news, right? There's been how many acquisitions so far this year since the beginning? So more M&A, more site transfers, more supplier switches. And the regulatory and supply chain leaders are really, running these programs. They're incredibly capable, but they're running it on the infrastructure that hasn't evolved in 20 plus years. And that expertise, really live in people's minds and spreadsheets still. Um, that really concerns me, because the consequences aren't abstract, right? If you look at the drug shortages that we track, it hit an all-time high of 323 drugs in early 2024 for the US. And even though these new shortages has been declining, there's still over 200 active shortages in the US. And supply chain remains structurally fragile. So when coordination breaks because the system really wasn't built to handle the volume and complexity of change, patients are the ones who pay the price, right? And we are all in this for the patients, and the people who are doing the work, who know this, and they really deserve better infrastructure. And I think that's what concerns me, right now.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because I mean, some of my current, active clients include, I would say mid to larger size pharmaceutical companies, and in my interactions, it's kind of funny to watch, the transformation from an AI standpoint come along. And still, I mean, they have further to go. We
Yeah.
constantly are talking about, tools that I use on the outside that, I think they would benefit from. But at the same time, I understand like the reservation as well. Let me put it that way. Um, I appreciate the fact that maybe from a regulatory standpoint that there might be, reluctance, but at the same time, like if we were to face the next global pandemic, um, tomorrow. And, I think AI could honestly, probably help. And we
Yeah.
probably would see somebody come along and go, hey, you look, I used this and I got this. And this is, potential answer for whatever the thing might be. And I do think there's an opportunity to sort of continue, even though you want to be conservative and understand that patients could, feel the impacts if we get this wrong. But on the other side, there's lots of things in every pharmaceutical company that I would say don't really touch a patient. So like, let's
Absolutely.
de-risk all of those and like, let's move forward
Yeah.
as quickly as we can. But then also like, let's take all of the other things that, are higher risk and like build consideration programs for them and go measure that risk for yourself.
Yeah. And I think, to build upon what you just said, Don, that's really what is exciting to me, as we look to the next, 3 to 5 years, right? For the first time, I really think that we have the technology to actually encode, the operational expertise that I've been talking about that's been trapped in, spreadsheets and people's heads for decades. So, not just automate document generation or track submission. I think that's table stakes, as you said. And I want to be precise about the distinction here because it really matters. Most of what the industry calls digital transformation, really is workflow automation, right? So moving tasks through a sequence, sending notifications or generating documents. And, that is not intelligence. And I think there's a fundamental difference. What I'm talking about and what truly excites me is building truly intelligent systems that actually know what's required in each country, for each change type or each new registration, and can reason through dependency or implementation requirements or submission sequencing the way, we would as the regulatory operational leaders. And to me, that's the leap, and that is the art of the possible. And it is possible today because of the frontier AI models that are being released by these companies. And we can build systems that think through regulatory strategy and not just execute like predefined steps. And what excites me is in the future, a regulatory operation leader managing one of these programs already knowing that these are the requirements in Brazil, and these requirements are shared between Brazil and Colombia, and those get shared or surfaced before they even start their planning. And that is the intelligence applied. And that's the frontier I'm most excited about. And I feel like we are closer to it than most people in the industry realize.
I think that's an extremely exciting time because I kind of think about the fact that let's just talk about the program that you talked about in your company example, whenever you were talking about, what you
Yeah.
guys do from a large scale transformation standpoint. Imagine the world where you could walk in the door tomorrow and assess all of those risks and be able to point to all 7 additional findings in a matter of seconds versus spending
Yeah.
a month, 2 months, or even longer trying to figure out where are the gaps so that we can make sure that we're protecting our client. It seems to me
Absolutely.
like it's just like our cars today, whenever they beep, whenever we try and change lanes with a car next to us. I mean, yes, part of that is table stakes, but also thank goodness those sounds are there sometimes because I know
Absolutely.
I've counted on that fact of having that traffic collision avoidance here and there. So yeah.
Oh, absolutely. It's almost like your execution partner, right? Or your strategist, basically, that is sitting with you. That's why Microsoft called it a co-pilot, right? It truly is your co-pilot. And I think those are the solutions that we should be striving towards. And I'm super excited about, what we'll see coming out in the next, few months to the next year.
Well, Megha, thank you so much for being on the Life Science Success podcast.
Thank you.
I greatly appreciated you being here, and it was exciting to get to talk to somebody in this space that has all the experience that you have, and I greatly appreciate your sharing your story with us. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me, Dawn, and congratulations again for being, one of the top podcasts for our industry.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you for listening to Life Science Success. For complete details about this podcast, including show notes, how to get in touch with guests, and more episodes, please visit www.lifesciencesuccess.com. If there's someone you'd like for us to invite to the show as a guest, please let me know by sending me a message at the podcast website. Please click subscribe on your favorite podcast app, share the podcast, or tell a friend about it, and last but not least, rate the podcast. Thank you again.